They took my hospital room. They turned it into a punchline. They took my surgery. They made it an inconvenience. They took my sister's wedding and put it above the machine, keeping my heart rate on a screen. My mother texted me a photo of a 3-tier cake. A nurse was still taping the IV line to the back of my hand. My father called it drama. My sister called it timing. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone back. I just turned the phone face down on the blanket. I let the monitor keep beeping. But here's what none of them knew. Standing in that ballroom in their rented shoes, I was already the only name on a piece of paper. That paper would decide whether they kept their house. 2 winters later, they'd sit across a conference table from me. They'd slide a form toward my hand. They'd smile like nothing had ever happened. Then a lawyer would open a binder. None of them had ever been allowed to see it. But before the binder, there was the wedding. The monitor beside my hospital bed was still beeping. That's when my mother texted a photo of my sister's cake. She wrote, "Wish you could see this in person, sweetie. My name is Margaret Doyle. Everyone calls me Maggie." My mother only uses Margaret when she wants something to sound official. I am 29 years old. I was 27 the night my appendix decided it was done waiting for a more convenient week. I did not scream. I did not beg. I worked nights on the surgical floor at Mercy Dubuque. That meant I'd watched 100 families do the thing my family was about to do. You learn things standing at the foot of other people's beds for 6 years. You learn who shows up. You learn who checks their phone in the doorway, like the hallway's a waiting room they'd rather not be in. I always told myself I was different. Then one Friday night, my own appendix put me flat on a gurney. I found out exactly which kind of family I actually had. It was the 10th of October. My sister Brooke's wedding was the 11th. It was at the Cedar Falls Grange Hall, 40 minutes from the hospital where I worked. I'd already picked up an extra shift that week. It helped cover the cost of a pale green dress. My mother picked it because it wouldn't, in her words, pull focus. 27 years old. And I'd spent most of my life not pulling focus. I was fine with it, mostly. The way you're fine with a low hum in old walls, you stop hearing it. The pain started slowly at 4 in the afternoon, low on my right side. I blamed the salad. I'd eaten it too fast between patients. By 8, it had teeth. By 10, I was doubled over in the break room. Dr. Osei was an ER attending. She'd pulled 2 12-hour shifts that week. She still had the patience to look at me twice. "You're not going home, Maggie," she said. "You're going downstairs." I called my mother from a gurney in the imaging hallway. A fluorescent light flickered above me. "Mom, it's my appendix. They're taking me into surgery in about an hour." There was a pause. Not shock. Arithmetic. "Tonight?" she said. "Maggie, the rehearsal dinner is tonight." "I know," I said. "I'm not asking anyone to come. I just didn't want you to hear it from someone else." "Well, of course we're not going to miss the rehearsal dinner," she said. Like I'd proposed the outrageous thing, not her. "Your father already has the toast written. Brooke would be devastated." "I'm not asking you to come," I said again. I wanted it said twice, clean, so there'd be no confusion later about who asked for what. "We'll call you after," she said. "Get some rest, honey." Honey. She always used the soft word right before the hard thing. They wheeled me back 40 minutes later. The last thing I remember, before the anesthesia took me, was the ceiling tiles sliding past, evenly spaced. I remember thinking I hoped Brooke's dress fit right in the shoulders. Flat on my back, mask coming down. Some old function in me still ran toward taking care of everyone else first. I woke at 2 in the morning in a recovery bay. My throat was raw from the tube. A nurse named Renata checked my vitals every 15 minutes. Quiet, competent hands. I recognized them from my own shift. My phone sat in a plastic bag on the rolling tray. I picked it up before I'd fully surfaced. One text, sent at 11:47 p.m. I was on a table with my own insides open to the light. A photo. Three-tier cake, white sugared lavender sprigs, lit gold by string lights. Under it, wish you could see this in person, sweetie. Feel better. I read it twice. Then I turned the phone face down on the blanket. I looked at the ceiling. I did not cry. You might expect I felt rage. I didn't. What I felt was closer to recognition. A lab result, confirming something I'd quietly suspected for years but never said out loud. My mother had told me, in her own handwriting, exactly where I stood. I did not call her back that night, or the next morning when Renata helped me sit up. A resident checked the incision. He told me I'd done well. The appendix had been close to rupturing. A few more hours would have meant a very different conversation. "Anyone coming to pick you up?" Renata asked, checking my chart. "I'll call a car," I said quietly. She looked at me a second longer than the question required. Then she nodded, the way you nod at someone when you already know the shape of what they're not saying. I called a car, home to my apartment on Iowa Street, 11 minutes from the hospital. My hands were too weak that morning for the deadbolt, so I let myself in with the spare key under the mat. I lay down under my own blanket, on my own couch. I slept 6 hours. When I woke, there were 2 more texts. Brooke, hope or feeling better? Sorry you're missing everything, it's so beautiful here. My father, thumbs up in a rented tux, knocked him dead with the toast. I did not go to the wedding. Nobody expected me to by then. That was its own kind of message. I spent the day of my sister's wedding alone. I moved slowly because of the incision. I ate crackers off the discharge sheet. At 6 in the evening, I imagined Brooke walking the aisle. The dress fit right in the shoulders. I got up. I walked to my kitchen table. I did something that surprised even me. I opened the folder. 3 years earlier, at my grandfather's funeral, his attorney pulled me aside in the parking lot. His name was Underwood. He'd handled the family's business since before I was born. He handed me a small manila envelope. Inside was a single folded card, cream-colored, soft at the edges, the way paper gets when someone has handled it many times before finally letting it go. "Your grandfather wanted you to have this," Underwood said. "He said you'd know when to open it." I hadn't opened it. Not at the funeral. Not in the weeks after. Not in the 3 years since. I'd carried it through 2 apartment moves, tucked in a shoebox of things I didn't look at often. I told myself I was saving it. The truth is, I was afraid of what it might ask of me, or afraid it would ask nothing at all, that it was just a kind old man's sentimental note. Some stubborn part of me needed it to stay unopened. Still possible. That night, 27 years old, one photo of a cake into understanding exactly where I ranked in my own family, I finally opened it. I'm not going to tell you yet what it said. I read it 4 times. I did not cry the first 3 readings. On the 4th, sitting at my kitchen table with the porch light off and my incision aching, I did. I put the card back in its envelope. The envelope went in my nightstand drawer, under a stack of old pay stubs I never got around to throwing away. I went back to work 3 days later. That's what I do. I told no one in my family what I now knew. I had learned that, watching 100 families from the foot of 100 beds. The people who talk loudest about what they're owed are rarely the ones who actually deserve it. That was 2 winters ago. I'm not going to tell you I plotted anything. I didn't. I went back to 12-hour shifts. I kept sending my parents $600 a month. The same $600 I'd sent since I started my first nursing job at 23. Back then, my father's construction business hit a rough stretch. It felt like the kind of thing a good daughter did without being asked twice. Nobody in my family knew I was still doing it. It had become furniture in my life, an auto pay line between my student loan and my car insurance. A fact so ordinary I'd almost stopped noticing it, the way you stop hearing a hum in old walls. I didn't send that money out of guilt. I didn't stop sending it out of spite. Both would make this a simpler story than it is. What actually happened took 2 winters. It started on an ordinary Tuesday in February. A strip mall law office, fluorescent lighting almost exactly like the hallway I'd been wheeled through the night of my surgery. I walked in to ask my grandfather's old attorney a simple question about a tax form. He told me something that had nothing to do with taxes at all. That's where this really starts. Before any of that, though, there's a smaller thing worth knowing about who I already was. On the surgical floor, my charge nurse used to say I had quiet hands. Her name was Patty Alcala. She'd worked at Mercy Dubuque for 26 years. It's the highest compliment anyone in that building gives another nurse. It means you don't panic. You don't announce your competence. You just do the work correctly and let the outcome speak for you. 3 months before my appendix ruptured, I caught a medication dosing error on an elderly patient's chart, a decimal point off by a factor of 10, the kind of mistake that kills people quietly if nobody catches it. I caught it not by luck, but by the same habit Elmer kept in his own ledger, reading every number twice, trusting nothing that hadn't been checked against something else. Patty wrote me up for a commendation that month, a small thing, a line in a file somewhere in HR, the kind of recognition that never makes it to a family dinner table. It doesn't come with a cake or a toast or a hashtag. I never mentioned it to my parents. I'm not sure it would have registered if I had. My family measured accomplishment in the currency Brooke traded in. Weddings, Pinterest boards, photographs with good lighting. There was no line item in that currency for a decimal point caught at 2 in the morning. Not on a Tuesday, nobody but the patient's family would ever remember. This explains something about how I was built, long before Underwood ever opened a folder in front of me. I already knew how to read a chart nobody wanted to hand me directly. I already knew how to sit with a hard number until it made sense, rather than flinching away because the sum was uncomfortable. Elmer had noticed that in me since I was 16, since I bought him a thermos with a diner paycheck instead of asking him for anything in return. My parents never noticed it at all. That turned out, in the end, to be the single largest miscalculation either of them ever made. 9 years before the wedding, I was 20 years old. My grandfather, Elmer Doyle, was still alive, still driving his own truck out to the 80 acres east of Cedar Falls. That land had been in the family since before the highway came through. Elmer built a small construction supply business from nothing. He sold most of it off in his 60s. He kept the farmhouse, the land, and a modest but real trust that held the proceeds. He was the kind of man who wrote things down. Every receipt, every loan he made to a neighbor, every dollar he lent his own son, my father Frank, and whether it came back. My father was Elmer's only child. In most families, that would have made the money's path simple. Frank Doyle was not a simple man to hand money to. He had charm, the kind that gets you a seat at every table in a town like Cedar Falls. He had a habit, going back decades, of treating whatever wasn't nailed down as provisional, as something that would eventually become his if he was patient and pleasant about it. My mother, Carol, matched him well in that regard. She had a gift for making generosity sound like an obligation you'd already agreed to. Carol Doyle grew up 2 towns over, the daughter of a schoolteacher. She married my father at 22, convinced, I think genuinely, that his charm meant something deeper than it turned out to mean. By the time I knew her, she'd spent 3 decades perfecting a specific talent, the ability to describe an uneven family as a happy one, using the exact right words in the exact right order so anyone listening from outside would hear devotion instead of imbalance. She was not a cruel woman in any way you could point to directly. She simply never once, in 29 years, asked me whether the arrangement felt fair from where I stood. Asking would have required an answer she wasn't prepared to sit with. I was the older daughter. Brooke came 4 years after me. From the day she arrived, something in the household's weather changed. I don't say this bitterly. I say it the way you'd read a chart. Here are the vitals. Here is the pattern. Draw your own conclusion. Brooke was easier to love out loud. She cried less as a baby, smiled more as a toddler. She grew into the kind of teenager who got invited places. I got good grades, a part-time job at 15, and a reputation inside my own family as the one who didn't need much. Being needed and being loved get confused a lot in families like mine. Nobody ever sat me down and explained the difference. I had to work that out for myself, mostly at 2 in the morning, mostly alone, mostly on hospital floors that weren't even mine. My grandfather noticed things other people didn't bother to notice. When I was 16, I got my first real paycheck from the diner on Route 20. I used part of it to buy him a thermos. His old one had a crack down the side. He never mentioned it to anyone, just kept using it anyway. He carried that thermos every day for the rest of his life. He never said much about it. He didn't need to. That was Elmer's whole language, showing up in small, exact, undramatic ways, expecting the people around him to notice. Most of them didn't. Most of them were too busy performing gratitude for bigger things to notice a 16-year-old girl replacing a cracked thermos with a diner paycheck. By the time I was 20, Elmer's health had started to slip. My father had started to circle. I use that word deliberately. Frank would visit the farmhouse more often that year, always with some reason connected to money. A construction contract that had fallen through, a truck payment that had gotten away from him, a temporary cash flow problem that never seemed to resolve, just migrate to a new shape every few months. My grandfather lent him money more than once. I know because I saw the ledger years later in Elmer's own handwriting, dates and amounts. Besides several entries, a single word, unpaid. I was in nursing school by then, working part-time at a pharmacy to cover what my scholarship didn't. I remember one Sunday dinner at the farmhouse. My father asked Elmer in front of all of us whether he'd thought any more about simplifying things. That was Frank's way of asking whether Elmer would hand over the trust administration to him directly. Cut out Underwood's fees. Keep it in the family. Elmer set down his fork. He looked at my father for a long moment. Frank, he said, I've been simplifying things my whole life. It's why there's still something left to talk about. Nobody laughed. My mother changed the subject to Brooke's upcoming homecoming dance. I watched my grandfather's face. I remember thinking he'd just said something important. Nobody at that table besides the two of us had actually heard it. After dinner that night, my parents loaded the dishwasher. Brooke disappeared upstairs to call a friend about the dance. Elmer asked me to walk out to the barn with him, ostensibly to check a leak in the roof he'd been meaning to patch. We didn't talk about the leak. He stood there in the dim light, hands in his coat pockets. He asked me, plainly, whether I thought my father would ever change. I don't know, I told him. Honestly, because I'd learned by then he preferred honesty to comfort. I think he means well. I don't think meaning well and doing well are the same thing. Elmer nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd already worked out on his own. Your dad's not a bad man, he said. He's just never had to hold anything up by himself. Somebody's always been under it with him, taking most of the weight. He's convinced himself that means he built it. He looked at me for a long moment in the dark of the barn. You're the one who actually knows what weight feels like, Maggie. I've watched you carry it since you were 16 years old. You never said a word about it to anybody. I didn't know. Standing in that barn at 20, what he meant to do about it. I only knew, walking back to the house beside him, that some quiet decision had already been made. I wouldn't learn its full shape for another 6 years. 3 years later, a week before I turned 23, I started my first job as a licensed nurse. That same week, Elmer had a stroke in the kitchen of the farmhouse, alone, sometime on a Tuesday afternoon. He wasn't found until Frank stopped by that evening to ask about a truck payment. He died 4 days later, in the same hospital system I'd eventually work for. I sat with him twice during those 4 days. Once in the morning before my shift, once after, holding his hand, which had gone soft and papery in a way that still didn't feel real to me. He couldn't speak much by then. On the second visit, the last one, he squeezed my hand once, hard, like he was trying to tell me something through the pressure of his fingers instead of words. I told him it was okay, that he could rest, that I'd take care of things. I meant it the way you mean things to someone who's dying. I didn't know yet what taking care of things was going to actually mean. At the funeral, 3 days later, Underwood found me in the parking lot of the funeral home. My parents were still inside, accepting condolences from half the county. He was a tall, careful man in his 60s. He'd represented my grandfather for over 20 years. He had the particular stillness of someone who spends his working life holding other people's secrets, waiting for the right moment to set them down. "Maggie," he said, "your grandfather asked me to give you this personally, not through the mail, not with the rest of the family present." He handed me the small manila envelope. He said you'd know when to open it. I asked him what it was. "That's between you and him," Underwood said kindly. "I'm just the mailman on this one." He almost smiled. Elmer liked being specific about who delivered what. I put the envelope in my coat pocket. I went back inside. My mother was already deep in a conversation about the reception menu with my aunt. My father was shaking hands like he was running for something. Brooke, 17 then, cried the whole afternoon. Genuinely. I remember feeling grateful that at least one of us could do that openly. I couldn't. Not there. Not with an unopened envelope in my pocket and Underwood's words sitting strange and unexplained in my chest. The years after that mattered more than they seemed to at the time. I did not become suspicious of my family overnight. I did not start keeping files or building a case. I went to work. I got promoted to the surgical floor. I dated a physical therapist named Josh for a year and a half. It ended quietly, without much drama, the way most things in my life seemed to end. I kept sending the $600 a month. My father's business had another rough patch that second year. It was easier, honestly, to keep the peace with a wire transfer than to have the conversation about why he needed it again. Brooke got engaged the spring I turned 27. Her fiancé, Danny Tanner, worked in commercial real estate. He had a way of talking about square footage and appreciation, the way other men talk about sports. My parents adored him instantly and completely, the way they'd adored everything about Brooke's life since she was born. Effortlessly, like it required no maintenance at all. I liked Danny fine. He wasn't cruel. He was simply someone who'd walked into a family already tilted in his fiancée's favor. He never once had to ask why. He proposed at the county fair, by the Ferris wheel, in front of a crowd, because Brooke had once mentioned in passing that she'd like that someday. The wedding planning consumed my mother for 6 months. I heard about the venue, the caterer, the florist, the dress, in granular detail, on the phone, at Sunday dinners, in texts sent at odd hours, when she'd thought of one more detail she needed my opinion on. Never my money, though. Not directly. not in a way she'd admit to. I found out much later, from documents, not from her, that the wedding cost $81,000, financed partly through a home equity line my parents opened against the farmhouse, the same farmhouse Elmer had spent 40 years paying off. So it would belong, outright, free and clear to whoever came next. I didn't know any of that in October, the night my appendix ruptured. I only knew what everyone in this story starts out knowing, which is far less than what turns out to be true. Here's what I did know. By the time I was wheeled into recovery, throat raw, phone in a plastic bag on the tray, I already knew something. Exactly how this family sorted its priorities when a hospital bed and a wedding cake landed on the same calendar. I knew it the way you know a diagnosis you've already suspected for years, once the test finally confirms it. I didn't know yet what was actually written on the cream-colored card. It was sitting right there in my nightstand drawer. I found out 5 weeks after the wedding, in Underwood's office. On the Tuesday, I'd only come in to ask him a question about a 1099. Underwood's office sat above a dry cleaner on Main Street in Dubuque. 2 rooms and a small waiting area, the same brown carpet it had probably had since the Clinton administration. He still worked mostly alone. One paralegal 3 days a week, a fax machine he refused to replace. In his words, half the county banks still send things by fax. I'm not going to be the one holding up progress. I liked him. I'd liked him since the funeral, since the parking lot, since he'd handed me an envelope and told me it was between me and a dead man. I'd gotten a 1099 in the mail that January. It didn't make sense to me. A small distribution, $412, listed as coming from something called the Elmer J. Doyle Family Trust. I assumed it was a clerical error. Nobody in my family had ever told me I received distributions from anything. I brought the form in on my lunch break. I expected a 5-minute conversation and an apology for a mailing mistake. Underwood took the form. He put on his reading glasses. He went very quiet for a moment. "That's not a mistake," he said. "I don't understand. I've never gotten anything from Grandpa's trust before." "You have," he said. "Every year for the last 3 years. Small distributions, income only. The trust structure keeps most of it invested. You never noticed because it's a few $100s, and it comes in January with your other tax documents. I assumed, frankly, that someone in the family had explained your role to you by now." He took his glasses off. He looked at me directly. "The way doctors look at you right before they change the rest of your afternoon. Maggie, do you know that you're the successor trustee of your grandfather's trust?" I said no. I said it the way you say something when the words don't have anywhere to land yet. When your mouth is forming a sentence your brain hasn't caught up to. The vinyl chair creaked when I shifted my weight. Somewhere down the hall, the fax machine hummed to life, uninvited, and neither of us looked at it. "Your grandfather amended the trust 2 years before he died," Underwood said. "He named your father as trustee initially. That's what everyone in the family assumed would simply continue. But Elmer added a successor provision, naming you, specifically, to take over trustee duties under 2 conditions: his death, and a finding, made by me as the trust's attorney, that the acting trustee was mismanaging assets or operating outside the trust's terms." He paused. "Both conditions have been met for approximately 14 months. I sat very still in that vinyl chair across from his desk. The same kind of chair I'd sat in at 100 family meetings, 100 hospital conference rooms. I asked him, in a voice steadier than I felt, what exactly my father had done. Underwood pulled a folder from his cabinet, a folder I'd come to know very well over the following months. He laid out, in his careful, unhurried way, what he'd been documenting since Elmer's death. My father had, as trustee, made distributions to himself and to Brooke, amounts that exceeded what the trust document allowed for discretionary use. Small ones at first, a few hundred here, a few hundred there, easy to miss if nobody was looking closely. More seriously, he'd used trust assets as informal collateral, a letter of intent to a regional bank. It referenced the trust's holdings. He'd used it to apply for the construction loan, the one that would eventually fund most of Brooke's wedding, and the down payment on her and Danny's new house. He'd done this without trustee authority to pledge trust assets for a beneficiary's personal debt, without informing me, the actual successor trustee, that any of it was happening. "Why didn't you tell me 14 months ago?" I asked. "Because Elmer built in a waiting period," Underwood said. "He didn't want you stepping into this the moment it triggered. He wanted you to come to it on your own, in your own time. It's an unusual instruction. I'll admit I found it frustrating as an attorney. But it was his trust, and it was his condition. I've spent 30 years honoring exactly the instructions my clients give me, especially the ones I don't fully understand." He closed the folder. He also said something else when we drafted the amendment. I wrote it down because it struck me as important. The one who shows up empty-handed is the one who's really there. Give her the pen when she asks for it, not before. I didn't say anything for a while. I thought about the wedding cake photo. I thought about Renata checking my vitals every 15 minutes, while my family stood in a rented ballroom 40 minutes away. I thought about the $600 I'd been sending every month. That household was, apparently, also quietly drawing against a trust I hadn't known I controlled. "There's one more thing," Underwood said. He reached into a different drawer, one I hadn't seen him open before. "Your grandfather kept a binder, personal notes mostly, alongside the formal trust documents. He asked me to hold it until you asked for it directly. I wasn't going to volunteer it. But given what we've just discussed, I think it's time." He set a black 3-ring binder on the desk between us. It was heavier than it looked, thick with papers tabbed in Elmer's own handwriting, the same square, careful letters I recognized from the ledger he kept on the farmhouse's kitchen counter. I didn't open it there. I asked if I could take it home. Underwood said, of course, it was mine. It had always been mine. It had simply been waiting on a shelf for 14 months for me to ask the right question. That night, at my kitchen table, in the same chair where I'd first opened the card 2 winters before, I finally read the inside cover, what my grandfather had written there. Blue ink faded only slightly with time. "To whoever ends up holding this, I have watched money change people my whole life. It changes some people fast, like a fever, and other people slow, like rust. And by the time you notice the rust, it's already gotten into the load-bearing parts of a person. I built this trust so that whoever showed up the way you show up, quietly, without asking, without performing it, would have something solid under them when everyone else's rust finally gave way. I don't know which of my grandchildren this will be. I suspect I already do. If it's you, Maggie, you'll know because you'll be the one who came to the hospital in the middle of the night without being asked, and you'll be the one nobody thanked for it. That's not an insult to you. It's an insult to them. Take the pen when it's time. Don't apologize for it." I read it 4 times, the same way I'd read the card 2 winters earlier. I did not open the folded card again that night. I already knew, roughly, what it said. Sitting there with the binder open under the kitchen light, I understood something. The card and the binder were the same message, delivered twice, 3 years apart, by a man who'd known exactly what kind of family he was leaving behind. He'd built something solid into its foundation anyway, quietly, the way he did everything. I still didn't tell my parents. Not that week, not that month. It would have been easy to march into their kitchen with a binder under my arm and let the whole thing detonate right there. That's not what my grandfather asked for. More than that, it's not who I am. I don't raise my voice. I read the chart. I went back to work. I kept sending the $600. Stopping it suddenly would have told them something was different before I understood the full shape of what was different. Elmer's ledger habit was the one thing of his I'd apparently inherited, along with the trustee pen. Gather the whole picture before you move a single piece of it. So I started pulling records. Quietly, the way you'd chart a patient you suspected of something you hadn't confirmed yet. Underwood gave me trustee access to the trust's accounts. Legally, it was mine the moment I asked for it. It turned out to be one folder and one login on a regional bank's outdated website. Nothing dramatic. No secret vault. Just a checking account and an investment account. They'd sat there for 3 years, accumulating small dividends. My father used the trust's name, not always its money, to make himself look solvent to people who mattered to him. At that point, the trust held $190,000 in the investment account, plus the 80 acres east of town, which Underwood valued conservatively at another $210,000, plus the farmhouse itself, which the trust technically owned outright, simply allowing my parents to live in rent-free. Elmer had set that up so they'd never have to worry about housing. My father had apparently decided at some point that meant the house was functionally his to leverage. I found the letter of intent Underwood had mentioned, a copy the bank eventually sent to his office once he started asking pointed questions on my behalf. It was dated 14 months earlier, my father's signature at the bottom. It described family trust assets available to support this application, implying, without technically lying outright, that the trust itself stood behind the loan. The loan was for $340,000 to Brooke and Danny for the construction of a house on a lot Danny had bought 2 years earlier in a new development outside Dubuque. My father had co-signed it. The farmhouse, the one Elmer spent 40 years paying off, was listed as additional collateral, a fact my father apparently never mentioned to my mother. I'd learn later that even she didn't fully understand what he'd pledged. This is the part where the shape of the story changed for me. Up to this point, my family's cruelty had been the kind you could carry without it costing you money. A text message, a missed visit, a pale green dress. What I found in that bank folder was different. It wasn't just that they hadn't shown up for me. Without my knowledge, they'd put my dead grandfather's protection of his own family on the table as poker chips. For my sister's wedding, for her husband's new house. And they'd done it counting silently on the fact that nobody, least of all me, was paying close enough attention to notice. I kept the $600 going that month for reasons that were tangled even to me. Partly it was habit. Partly it was the last thread of an old version of myself. She still believed that if she just held everything together a little longer, the family underneath it would notice the effort and change shape around it. I don't think that version of me was naive. I think she was doing the only thing she knew how to do. Hold weight quietly. Wait for someone to ask her to put it down. Nobody asked. Instead, 3 weeks after I found the letter of intent, my parents invited me to a Sunday dinner at the farmhouse, the first one since the wedding. My father brought up the loan over pot roast in front of Brooke and Danny, like it was a piece of family logistics he assumed I'd already blessed. Danny and I have been talking to the bank, Frank said, cutting into his meat without looking up. The construction loan's coming up on its balloon payment next year. We're going to need to refinance the whole thing, roll it into something longer term. Might use some of your grandfather's trust as security again. since the bank already likes seeing it on paper. My mother nodded along, like this was as ordinary as discussing the weather. Brooke didn't even look up from her phone. Danny said, "Yeah, it really smoothed things out last time, having that behind us." I set my fork down. I did not raise my voice. I asked one question, the kind of question I'd learned to ask on the surgical floor when a patient's story didn't quite match their chart. "Which trust are you talking about?" Frank looked at me like I'd asked something slightly stupid. "Dad's trust. Your grandfather's. You know the one." "I do know the one," I said, calmly. "I just wanted to make sure we were talking about the same trust, since I'm the trustee." The table went quiet, the specific way a room goes quiet when a sentence lands wrong and nobody's sure yet whether it landed on purpose. My father actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "You're not the trustee, Maggie. I've been handling that since Dad passed." "You were?" I said, still calm. "Underwood can walk you through the amendment if you want the exact language. I'd rather not do it over pot roast. You might picture the room erupting. It didn't." My mother said, "Margaret, this really isn't the time," using the name she saves for when she wants something to sound settled. Brooke asked if this meant the wedding gift they'd used from the trust account was somehow in trouble. Danny looked at his plate like it had personally wronged him. My father just stared at me for a long moment. I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, more like a man recalculating an equation he'd assumed was permanently solved. "We'll talk about this later," he said, which is what people say when they intend to talk about it never. Or at least not until they've had time to build a version of events that makes them look better. I didn't push it further that night. I finished my pot roast. I complimented my mother's biscuits, which were, in fact, very good. You can hold two true things at once: that someone has wronged you and that their biscuits are excellent. Pretending otherwise is its own kind of dishonesty. I drove home an hour later, both hands steady on the wheel. I did not cry until I was parked in my own driveway with the engine off. Even then, it wasn't very long. It wasn't very loud. The following week, going back through the trust's transaction history one more time, more carefully this time, I found something I hadn't been looking for. A small, recurring disbursement, $200 a month, going out to an account under the name Denise Halloran. I didn't recognize the name at first. It took a call to my aunt, my father's cousin, to learn that Denise Halloran was Elmer's niece. My father's cousin once removed. A woman in her 60s who'd worked at the same diner on Route 20, where I'd bought my grandfather his thermos. She'd quietly checked in on Elmer every week for the last 6 years of his life, driving him to doctor's appointments my father was always too busy to take him to. Elmer had built the $200 disbursement into the trust before he died, a small standing gift to a woman who'd shown up the same quiet way I had. Nobody in my family had ever mentioned her name to me. Not once. Not at the funeral. Not in 3 years since. It told me something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. My grandfather hadn't been protecting one person against everyone else. He'd been quietly identifying, one small act at a time, everyone in his orbit who showed up without being asked, building something solid under each of them, invisible to the people who never noticed anyone doing it. I called Denise that week, introduced myself. We talked for almost an hour. She cried a little. She told me about driving Elmer to his cardiology appointments in that same truck he'd used to run supply orders for 30 years, about the thermos he'd shown her once. His granddaughter Maggie had bought it for him. He'd never once had to buy another. I hadn't known he'd told anyone that story. Turns out he'd told several people. He just hadn't told the people who would have made it about themselves. I didn't say anything to my parents about Denise. I didn't need to. What I needed to do, 3 weeks after the Sunday dinner, on a Thursday in late August, was stop the $600. So I did. I didn't call to explain it. I didn't send a text laying out my reasoning. I simply logged into my bank's app, found the recurring transfer I'd set up 6 years earlier and never once revisited, canceled it. It took less than a minute. I sat there afterward for a while, waiting to feel something dramatic, some rush of righteousness or grief. What I actually felt was quiet. The particular quiet of setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long, your arms had simply stopped registering the weight. The balloon payment on Brooke and Danny's construction loan was due in 11 weeks. I found that number the same way I found everything else that year, by reading a document nobody had shown me on purpose. Underwood pulled the loan file directly from the bank, exercising trustee rights he said most people never bothered to use. There it was, in black print, $340,000. Structured as an interest-only construction loan, with a balloon payment of $281,000 due at the end of month 18. Danny had apparently agreed to that structure because the interest-only payments were easier to swing while the house was being built. The theory was they'd refinance into a normal 30-year mortgage well before the balloon came due. The theory had a hole in it. The hole was interest rates. In the 18 months since Danny signed that loan, rates had climbed. High enough that the refinance they'd counted on no longer penciled out. Their new monthly payment, at current rates, would run almost $1,100 more than what they'd budgeted for. Danny's income from commercial real estate had also softened that year, down about 20% from the numbers he'd used on the original application. None of this was fraud, exactly. It was just two people who'd built a house on a set of assumptions that hadn't held, and a father who'd quietly volunteered his own father's trust as the airbag. By extension, my inheritance. For a crash he'd convinced himself would never happen. I didn't feel triumphant learning any of this. It would be easy to tell this story as a woman gleefully watching her family's finances collapse. That's not what it was. I felt mostly tired. Tired the way you feel at hour 10 of a double shift. The adrenaline that got you through the first 6 hours has burned off. What's left is just the job, still in front of you, still needing to be done correctly, regardless of how you feel about doing it. I did the job. I asked Underwood to formally document, in writing, that I'd assumed active trustee duties as of the date I first requested access to the accounts. That put a clean, legal line in the sand. Everything before that date was my father's responsibility. Everything after it was mine to manage, according to the trust's actual terms, not according to what anyone assumed those terms allowed. Underwood said this was, in his professional opinion, the single smartest thing anyone in your family has done with this trust in 14 months. From a man as careful with his words as Underwood, that felt like a small parade. I didn't say much back. I just thanked him and asked what came next. And he told me plainly that next was patience. My father called me twice that week. I let both calls go to voicemail, not out of spite. I'd learned that over 6 years of nursing. Some conversations go better when you've had time to think through what you'll say, instead of reacting live to whatever tone someone opens with. He left a message the second time, his voice doing the thing it always did when he was trying to sound reasonable while asking for something unreasonable. Maggie, it's Dad. Look, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding about the trust stuff. I'd like to sit down, just the two of us, and talk it through like adults. This is family. We shouldn't need lawyers for family. I noticed the word lawyers, plural, when I'd mentioned exactly one lawyer, the same one who'd represented our family for over 20 years. I noticed, too, that he called it a misunderstanding, not a mistake. That told me he still believed at that point that the real problem was my perception of events, rather than the events themselves. I did call him back eventually 3 days later, on a Saturday. My day off, sitting on my own back steps with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. I kept my voice level the entire conversation. I did not raise it once. Not when he suggested I was punishing the whole family for something that happened years ago. Not when he brought up, unprompted, all the ways he'd always tried to be fair between Brooke and me. A claim so far from the ledger I'd been reading that I almost laughed and didn't. Laughing would have given him something to react to. I'd decided that in the strip mall office, 5 weeks after the wedding. I wasn't going to give any of them anything to react to anymore. I was just going to be accurate. I'm not punishing anyone, I told him, evenly. I'm doing what Grandpa's trust document says the trustee is supposed to do. That's protect the trust's assets according to its terms. If you want to refinance Brooke and Danny's loan without trust assets as collateral, that's between you, them, and the bank. I'm not going to authorize using the trust for it. The trust doesn't allow discretionary distributions of that size without documented cause. And my daughter's balloon payment is due isn't documented cause under the terms Grandpa wrote. He's your grandfather too, Frank said. You think he'd want you doing this to your own family? I thought about the binder. I thought about the line he'd written, in blue ink, about rust getting into the load-bearing parts of a person. I didn't quote it to my father. Some things you keep for yourself a little longer, especially when you suspect the person you'd be quoting them to isn't ready to hear them yet. I think he'd want the trust used the way he wrote it, I said plainly. That's all I'm doing. My father hung up first. I sat on the back steps for another 20 minutes after that. The coffee finished going cold. I didn't make a new cup. 3 weeks later, my mother called. A different tone entirely. Softer. The tone she used when she needed something, rather than when she was granting something. She said Brooke had been under so much stress with the loan situation, that the wedding debt combined with the construction overrun had put real pressure on the marriage, that Danny's parents couldn't help because they'd already given so much. I filed that detail away. I'd later learned Danny's parents had, in fact, offered to help and been quietly turned down by my father. He apparently didn't want another family's money involved in what he still considered his own trust to manage as he saw fit. Can't you just talk to the lawyer, my mother said, and explain that this is a family emergency? Surely there's some exception. There isn't, I said gently. I checked. I had, in fact, checked twice with Underwood, specifically because I wanted to be certain I wasn't letting any personal feeling color a decision that needed to be purely procedural. The trust allowed distributions for a beneficiary's health, education, or maintenance in accordance with their accustomed standard of living. A luxury home's balloon payment did not meet that standard. Not a construction loan neither beneficiary could actually afford at current rates. Not under any reading Underwood or I were willing to sign our names to. You've changed, my mother said quietly. It did land somewhere, a little, the way an old habit still tugs at you even after you've decided to stop indulging it. You used to be the one who held this family together. I still am, I said without heat. I'm just not going to be the one who holds it together by disappearing into it. She didn't have a response to that. We hung up without saying much else. I noticed, watching myself from a small distance the way you sometimes do in a hard conversation, that my hands weren't shaking. My voice hadn't climbed once. I felt, if anything, a strange calm settling into the space where I used to feel obligated to fix things I hadn't broken. 8 weeks before the balloon payment came due, Underwood called me on a Tuesday morning before my shift. He told me the bank had reached out to him directly. Danny and Brooke's refinance application had been denied. The lender cited debt-to-income ratios that no longer supported the loan amount. Underwood had specifically requested to see a note in the file. It referenced previously disclosed trust assets. The trust's actual trustee, meaning me, had now formally declined to make those available as security. "They're going to come to you," Underwood said, evenly. "Probably soon. Probably not gently." He was right on both counts. Before either of them came, I spent a Saturday morning at my kitchen table with Underwood's full accounting laid out in front of me. I wanted the whole ledger in my own head, in my own handwriting, the way my grandfather would have wanted it, before anyone else tried to tell me a version of it that suited them better. The wedding itself had run $81,000. $11,000 of it drawn directly against the home equity line on the farmhouse. The construction loan for Brooke and Danny's house stood at $340,000. It carried a balloon payment of $281,000 due at month 18. My father had moved $19,000 out of the trust's investment account. Over 4 separate withdrawals in the 18 months since Elmer's death. Each one logged as a family maintenance distribution, a category the trust document allowed only for genuine hardship, not for catering deposits and a photographer's final invoice. The trust itself still held $171,000 in investments, down from the $190,000 it carried the year before. Plus, the 80 acres, plus the farmhouse, unencumbered, except for the equity line my father had opened without ever mentioning it to me. Denise Halloran's standing gift, $200 a month, had never once been late, never once questioned. The smallest and steadiest line item in the entire ledger, and, I was starting to understand, the truest one. I added it all up twice, by hand. The way Elmer used to, at the kitchen counter, with a mechanical pencil and a legal pad. Numbers feel different when your own hand has to write them out instead of just reading them off a screen. $81,000 for the wedding. $19,000 quietly withdrawn since. $281,000 hanging over a house not yet finished. $600 a month for 6 years. $43,200 in total. That I had sent without being asked twice. Money the ledger didn't even count as part of the trust at all, because it had come straight from my own paycheck, never touching Elmer's accounts, never once acknowledged by anyone in my family as anything more than what a good daughter was simply supposed to do. I sat with that last number for a long time. $43,200 is not an abstraction, not when you've earned it 12 hours at a time, on your feet, in shoes that still ache by hour 10. I did not regret sending it. This was not a bitterer story than it actually is. I simply, finally understood the full shape of what I'd been carrying, in numbers precise enough that no one could later tell me I was exaggerating, or being dramatic, or misremembering the weight of it. I closed the notebook. I made a second cup of coffee. I let myself feel for exactly 1 minute before going back to the rest of the ledger. There was one more entry in that ledger I hadn't expected. Tucked into an old scanned folder, Underwood's paralegal had filed under a mislabeled tab, a second amendment, drafted 6 months after the first, small and easy to miss. It adjusted the successor trustee's authority to include the 80 acres east of town specifically. Land my father had once quietly explored selling to a development company 2 years earlier, before Elmer's health had started to fail. Elmer had never told anyone he knew about that conversation. He'd simply, without confrontation, without a single raised voice at any Sunday dinner, closed the door on it in writing. This was months before my father got far enough to bring it to me or Brooke. for a signature neither of us would have known to question. I called Underwood the evening I found it. He confirmed what I already suspected. Elmer had gotten wind of the development inquiry through an old friend on the County Planning Commission. He'd simply, quietly, made sure the door was already shut before anyone could try the handle. He never mentioned it to your father, Underwood told me. He said confronting Frank about it would only teach him to hide the next one better. He preferred to just make sure there wasn't a next one. I thought about that phrase for days afterward. Teach him to hide the next one better. It was, I realized, the exact same instinct I'd been operating on without ever naming it. The choice to document quietly rather than accuse loudly. To let the paperwork do the confronting instead of my own voice. For 2 winters, I'd thought I was simply following Elmer's instructions. Reading that Second Amendment, I understood I'd actually been following his character. That's a very different, much deeper kind of inheritance than money. I called Josh that week, the physical therapist I'd dated for a year and a half. Not to rekindle anything. He was one of the only people outside my family who'd been present for parts of this story as it happened in real time. Back when it was just a quiet, ordinary unfairness, rather than a legal one. We got coffee. I told him briefly what I'd found. He listened the way he always had, without trying to fix it before I'd finished describing it. You know, he said, I remember you telling me, right after your grandfather's funeral, you thought there was something you weren't supposed to know yet. I always wondered what that meant. So did I said, laughing a little. For 3 years. Does it feel like you expected it to? I thought about that question longer than the coffee probably warranted. No, I said finally. I thought finding out would feel like winning something. It mostly just feels like finally being handed an accurate map of a place I've been walking through blind for a long time. He nodded, like that answer made sense to him. It did. Josh had always been the kind of person who could sit with an answer that wasn't neat. He never rushed to sand its edges smooth. Brooke showed up at my apartment on a Wednesday evening, unannounced. She'd never once done that in the 6 years I'd lived there. I opened the door. She was standing on the mat, mascara smudged. She'd been crying in her car before she worked up the nerve to knock. For a second, just a second, the older sister instinct in me reached for her. Then the rest of me caught up and remembered why she was there. Can I come in? She asked. I let her in. I made tea. That's what you do, even for people who left you alone in a recovery bay 2 winters earlier. Being decent to someone in front of you and being angry at what they did in the past aren't actually opposites, whatever the movies tell you. Maggie, I don't understand what's happening, she said, wrapping both hands around the mug like it was the only warm thing in the room. Mom says you're refusing to help with the house. Dad says you've turned into someone he doesn't recognize. I don't know what any of that means. I just know Danny and I might lose the house we haven't even finished building yet. I asked her, gently, whether she knew what the trust had actually been used for to get the original loan. She didn't. I could see it land on her face in real time. The specific confusion of someone realizing a piece of her own life had been financed on paper she'd never read. I walked her through it, slowly, the way I'd walk a patient's family through a diagnosis, plainly, without editorializing, letting the facts do the emotional work instead of doing it for them. The letter of intent. The farmhouse listed as additional collateral. The trustee amendment naming me, 2 years before Elmer died, that our father had never once mentioned to either of us. He never told me any of that, Brooke said quietly. I thought Grandpa's trust was just, I don't know, sitting there, growing. I didn't know Dad was using it like a piggy bank. He wasn't supposed to be, I said, evenly. That's the part that matters. We sat there a while, not talking. The tea went lukewarm the way conversations sometimes let things go lukewarm around them. Finally, Brooke asked the question I think she'd actually come to ask. Underneath the loan and the house and all of it, is this about the wedding? About you being in the hospital and none of us coming? I thought about that question for longer than she probably expected me to. It would have been easy to say no, to protect her from the size of what I actually felt, the way I'd been protecting everyone in that family from the size of what I felt for most of my life. I didn't do that this time. It's not about punishing you for the wedding, I said. But I won't pretend that night didn't teach me something true about where I stood. I'm not undoing that lesson just because it's inconvenient for you now. Brooke didn't argue with that. She sat with it, which surprised me. After a minute, she said quietly, I'm sorry. I don't think I really understood at the time how bad it was that you were alone. That apology did not fix everything. Not in one sitting on a Wednesday evening with lukewarm tea between us. But it was the first true thing anyone in my family had said to me since the wedding. I let myself receive it as exactly that. One true thing. Not a full accounting. Not an ending. Just a start. I appreciate you saying that, I said gently. I do. But I still can't authorize the trust for the house. That's not personal. That's the job. She nodded, slowly, like she understood, even if she didn't fully agree yet. Brooke left an hour later. She hugged me at the door in a way that felt more real than any hug we'd exchanged in years. She didn't ask me to reconsider again. I don't think she fully believed walking out to her car that the loan situation was actually going to collapse the way it eventually did. I think she still believed, the way people believe things they need to believe, that her father would find a way to fix it, the way he always had, the way fathers in families like mine are expected to, right up until the moment it turns out they can't. My father did not come by unannounced. My father called Underwood's office directly, 3 times in 1 week. Underwood, professionally and correctly, referred him back to me as the acting trustee. My father did something I hadn't expected. Looking back, it told me more about the shape of his desperation than anything else in this entire story. He went to the county recorder's office. He tried to file a document challenging the trustee amendment. He argued it had been executed under diminished capacity, implying my grandfather hadn't been of sound mind when he named me successor trustee 2 years before his death. That claim fell apart the moment anyone checked the paperwork. Elmer had, at Underwood's insistence, gotten a full capacity evaluation from his own physician the same week he signed the amendment, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of challenge. Underwood told me about it with something close to admiration in his voice. Your grandfather, Underwood said, was already thinking about this exact conversation 2 years before he had any specific reason to. The recorder's office rejected the filing outright, citing the physician's evaluation already on record. My father's attempt at a legal challenge lasted exactly 9 days before it collapsed under its own weight. I learned it not from him. From a clerk's notice, addressed to me as trustee since I was now the party of record. I did feel something reading that notice. I won't pretend I didn't. It wasn't triumph, not exactly. It was closer to grief. The specific grief of watching a parent's desperation curdle into something you recognize, but no longer excuse. My father had spent his whole life being the kind of man who could talk his way into and out of almost anything. He tried to talk his way past a dead man's paperwork. He failed, quietly, without fanfare, without anyone in town even noticing. Watching it felt less like victory, more like watching someone finally run out of road they didn't know they'd been running out of for years. I called Denise Halloran again that week, mostly because I wanted to hear a voice that had known my grandfather without needing anything from him. She told me something I hadn't known. Elmer had once told her something, sitting in his truck outside the cardiology office, waiting for his appointment. He worried most about what happened to a family after the person holding it together quietly stopped doing the holding. He used to say, Denise told me, that most families don't fall apart all at once. They fall apart one unpaid favor at a time, and nobody notices until the person doing all the favors finally stops. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. I thought about the $600 I'd sent for 6 years without being asked twice. I thought about the wedding, the cake, the phone turned face down on a hospital blanket. I thought about how long I'd been the one holding, quietly, without anyone particularly noticing, and how strange it felt finally to set even a small piece of that weight down, to watch, in real time, what happened to the structure underneath it. 6 weeks before the balloon payment came due, my mother asked to meet in person, just the two of us, at a coffee shop on the square in Cedar Falls. Neutral ground, her words, as though we were negotiating a border instead of talking about a family. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. Partly, I'll admit, because some old habit in me still wanted to give her the chance to say something that mattered. She looked smaller across that little cafe table than I remembered her looking. That surprised me. My mother had always occupied more space than her actual size ever accounted for. She'd ordered a coffee she didn't touch. She folded and unfolded a napkin 3 or 4 times before she finally spoke. I need you to understand something, she said. Your father didn't do any of this to hurt you. He did it because he genuinely believed it would all work out, the way it always has. He's not a bad man, Maggie. He's just never had to be careful with anything, because someone always caught it before it hit the ground. I asked her, plainly, quietly, whether she meant me. She didn't answer right away. That was its own answer. I used to think love in this family was something you earned by being needed, I told her. I don't think that anymore. Being needed and being loved got confused a long time ago in this house. Nobody ever bothered to sort it out. I'm done being the one who absorbs the difference. My mother cried a little, quietly, into a napkin she'd already folded and unfolded past the point of usefulness. I didn't reach across the table. I wanted to. Some old current in me still wanted to. But I'd learned, slowly, over 2 winters, that comforting someone in the exact moment they're finally facing a consequence isn't kindness. Sometimes it's just another way of protecting them from learning anything at all. What happens now? She asked. If the loan actually falls through? Then it falls through, I said, without cruelty, and you'll all figure out how to live with the outcome of decisions that were made without me. The way I had to figure out how to live with a hospital room nobody showed up to. She didn't have an answer for that either. She left her coffee unfinished. I walked her to her car. I hugged her briefly, because despite everything, she is still my mother. Some things don't require forgiveness to remain simply, plainly true. 3 weeks later, Underwood called. The bank had scheduled a final meeting, at their request, to discuss the trust's involvement one last time, before the balloon payment came due. My father had specifically asked, through his own attorney, whether I'd attend in person, at a title office in downtown Dubuque, to clarify the trust's position directly. I said yes. I didn't know, agreeing to that meeting, exactly what my father intended to bring with him. I only knew one thing: walking out of the coffee shop that day, watching my mother's car pull away, I'd meet whatever was coming the way Elmer had taught me to meet everything, quietly, with the paperwork already in order. No need to raise my voice to be heard. The week before the meeting, I asked Underwood to bring the binder. Not copies of the trust document, not a summary, The actual binder, the one with Elmer's handwriting inside the cover, the one he'd told me I'd know when to ask for. Underwood looked at me for a moment when I said it. The same careful stillness he'd had in the funeral home parking lot 2 winters before. "You understand what you're asking me to do," he said. "Once that binder is open in a room with your parents in it, there's no putting it back on a shelf." "I know exactly what I'm asking," I said. "That's why I'm asking." He nodded once, the way a man nods when he's finally being handed the instruction he's been waiting 14 months to carry out. "Your grandfather would have wanted a title office," he said, almost to himself, closing his own folder. "He always said the county recorder does more honest work in an afternoon than most preachers do in a year." I laughed. A real laugh. The first one in weeks. It surprised me how much I needed it. I spent the days before the meeting doing ordinary things. I worked 2 shifts. I helped a 71-year-old man named Mr. Castellano off a gurney and back into a wheelchair after his hip replacement. He thanked me by name, twice, the way patients sometimes do when the pain finally starts easing and gratitude has somewhere to land. I watered the single fern I'd somehow kept alive on my kitchen windowsill for 3 years. I drove past the farmhouse once, slowly, not stopping, just looking at the porch light. Grandpa used to leave it on for anyone who might need to find their way up the drive after dark. Still burning. My parents had never once thought to ask why he kept it lit every single night, whether anyone was expected or not. I thought, more than once that week, about the folded card still sitting in my nightstand drawer, the one Underwood had handed me in a parking lot 2 winters ago, the one I'd read 4 times and never mentioned to anyone. I took it out on the Sunday night before the meeting and read it a 5th time. I am still not going to tell you everything it said. Some things are mine to keep exactly as private as my grandfather intended them to be. I'll tell you it named me specifically as the one he trusted to know the difference between being needed and being loved. It asked me, in his same square, careful handwriting, to do one thing. Make sure whoever came after me learned that difference sooner than I had. I put it back in its envelope. I put the envelope in my coat pocket, not the drawer. Walking into that title office the next morning, I wanted it close. The title office sat on the second floor of a squat brick building on Main Street in Dubuque. The kind of building that had probably closed 100 small, ordinary transactions a year for 40 years. Nobody outside those transactions ever noticed it existed. The conference room had a long table, a water pitcher nobody touched, and windows looking out over a parking lot half full of cars. People doing equally unremarkable, equally consequential things with their own lives that same morning. My father arrived first, in a suit I didn't recognize. The kind of suit you buy specifically for a meeting you've decided in advance to win. My mother came in beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. To anyone who didn't know them, it looked like support. To me, it looked like someone steadying a structure she suspected was about to fail. Brooke came separately, without Danny, and sat near the far end of the table, not next to our parents. A small positioning choice I noticed and understood. Underwood arrived last, exactly on time, the black binder under one arm, a slim folder under the other. He set both down on the table with the unhurried precision of a man who'd done this many times before. He never once needed to rush it. "Thank you all for coming," Frank said, taking charge of the room the way he took charge of every room he'd ever walked into, smiling at me specifically, a smile I recognized from 1,000 family photos, the smile of a man who believed, right up until the very last second, that charm could still close whatever gap the facts had opened. "I think we can get this sorted out quickly, if everyone's reasonable." I've had my attorney draw up a simple distribution request. All Maggie needs to do is sign off, release enough from the trust to cover the balloon payment. We can refinance the rest into something manageable. This doesn't have to be complicated. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. I looked at it. It was, as promised, simple. A trust distribution authorization, $281,000. Payable directly to the bank holding Brooke and Danny's construction loan. My signature line at the bottom, already dated for that day. I did not pick up the pen sitting there, right beside it. "Before I sign anything," I said. I kept my voice at the same level I'd use explaining a discharge plan to a nervous family. "I think there's something everyone in this room should hear. Mr. Underwood has some documents from my grandfather. They're relevant to how this trust actually works. It's time everyone heard them." My father's smile didn't fully leave his face. Not yet, but something behind it went very still. The particular stillness of a man watching a door he'd assumed was locked start to swing open on its own. "Maggie, I don't think we need to turn this into a production," he said. "It's a simple signature." "It's not a simple signature," Underwood said. When Underwood raised his voice, which he did only slightly, it landed harder in that room than any shout my father could have managed. "It's a signature on a document that assumes facts about trustee authority that have not been true for 14 months, Frank. Out of respect for Elmer, and out of respect for the actual law governing this trust, everyone at this table deserves to hear why." He opened the binder, slowly. He did not perform it. If you've only ever seen this kind of scene in a movie, you'd expect thunder. A raised voice. Someone standing up and knocking over a chair. Underwood simply turned to a tabbed page near the front. He adjusted his glasses. He read the paragraph Elmer had written into the trust amendment 2 years before he died. In the same unhurried voice he used to discuss property taxes. "I, Elmer J. Doyle, being of sound mind, as evidenced by the attached physician's evaluation dated the same day as this amendment, do hereby name Margaret Ann Doyle as successor trustee of the Elmer J. Doyle Family Trust, effective immediately upon either my death or a documented finding by my attorney of record that the acting trustee has managed trust assets outside the terms specified herein. This provision may not be challenged on grounds of my capacity, as the attached evaluation was obtained specifically to foreclose such a challenge. It is my clear and considered wish that Margaret Ann Doyle assume full trustee authority under these conditions, without requiring her request, and without further consent from any other party." The room was very quiet. My mother's hand had gone still on my father's arm. Brooke had set down her phone entirely. For the first time since she'd sat down. "That amendment," Underwood continued, "was executed and filed the same week Elmer obtained a full capacity evaluation from Dr. Okafor at Mercy Dubuque, specifically anticipating a challenge like the one Frank attempted to file with the county recorder's office 11 weeks ago. That filing was rejected. I have the rejection notice here, if anyone would like to see it." Nobody asked to see it. "The second condition," Underwood said, turning another tabbed page, "was met when I documented something in writing. Frank had pledged trust-adjacent representations to a lending institution, without trustee authority to do so. I have the letter of intent here as well. It states, and I'll read the relevant line exactly, 'Family trust assets available to support this application.' Frank was not authorized under the terms of this trust to make that representation. He did so anyway, in support of a personal loan for a beneficiary's private home construction, a use the trust document explicitly does not permit, without documented cause tied to health, education, or an established standard of living. A wedding, and a house built beyond what either beneficiary could independently qualify for do not meet that standard. My father's face had gone through several colors by that point. The specific progression I recognized from watching families receive hard diagnoses, denial curdling into something closer to fear, as the facts refused to move regardless of how firmly he stared at them. "This is insane," he said, but his voice had lost the confidence it carried when he'd walked in. "I've run this family's finances for 30 years. I built the business that put food on this table. You're going to let a piece of paper my father signed when he was already sick decide that none of that counts?" "He wasn't sick when he signed it, Frank," Underwood said calmly. He was healthy, deliberate, and specifically prepared for this exact conversation. I think, honestly, he anticipated it better than either of us did. I hadn't said much up to that point. I'd let Underwood carry the weight of the documents because that was, quite literally, his job. Hearing this from a neutral attorney landed differently than hearing it from his own daughter. But there was one more thing on the table. It needed to come from me. I reached into my coat pocket. I set the small manila envelope down next to the binder. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Not for this part. "I've had this since Grandpa's funeral," I said. 3 years. I finally opened it 2 winters ago, the night of Brooke's wedding, sitting alone at my kitchen table because none of you were there. I'm not going to read it to you. It's mine. But I want you to know it exists. I think it's the reason I've been able to sit here today and not raise my voice once, even though every part of what's on this table hurt to learn." My mother started to cry, quietly, into the same kind of folded napkin she'd used at the coffee shop weeks earlier. Except there was no napkin this time, just her own hand pressed against her mouth. "I'm not going to sign the distribution," I said, turning back to my father. "Not because I want to punish anyone, because it isn't mine to give away on those terms, and it never was. Grandpa built this trust so the load-bearing parts of this family would hold even after he was gone. I'm not going to be the one who lets it collapse. Not just because collapsing would be easier in this exact minute for the people asking me to." "So what happens to Brooke's house?" my father asked. For the first time that morning, his voice cracked slightly. Not with performance, with something closer to real fear. "That's between Brooke, Danny, and the bank," I said. "The same way my hospital room was between me and a monitor 2 winters ago. Nobody in this family thought it was worth rearranging a rehearsal dinner over." Nobody had a response to that. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was just quiet. The ordinary quiet of a room where everyone had finally run out of things to say. Nothing left that would change what had already been read into the record. Underwood closed the binder. "I'll have my office send formal notice to the bank," he said, confirming the trust's position and Maggie's status as sole trustee. "I'd also recommend, Frank, that your own attorney review whether pledging trust-adjacent language on a private loan application creates any personal exposure for you. I'm not your lawyer. That's not my concern today. But I'd want to know if I were you." My father didn't answer. He picked up the unsigned distribution form. He folded it in half. He put it back in his jacket pocket, a small, defeated motion. It told me more about where things actually stood than anything he could have said out loud. Brooke spoke then, for the first time since she'd sat down, her voice thin but steady. "Dad, did you know, this whole time, that Maggie was the trustee? Before any of this? Before the wedding, even?" Frank didn't answer right away. The pause did the answering for him. "I knew there was an amendment," he said finally. "I didn't think it would ever actually matter. I thought I'd have things stabilized long before it came up." "That's not the same as not knowing," Brooke said quietly. I watched something pass across my sister's face I hadn't seen there in years, maybe ever. A kind of clear-eyed recalculation of a man she'd spent her whole life being told to admire without question. You let me build a house on money that wasn't secure, and you didn't tell me the one person who could actually secure it wasn't even you. I was trying to protect this family, Frank said. I believe even now that some part of him actually thought that was true. The way people often believe the version of themselves that lets them keep going. You were trying to protect the version of yourself where none of us knew, I said. Where none of us knew you'd stopped being able to hold this up alone? I didn't say it cruelly. I said it the way you'd read a lab value back to a patient. One who's been avoiding the appointment that would confirm what they already suspected. That's not the same thing, Dad. It never was. He didn't answer that either. He stood up. He buttoned his jacket, the same jacket he'd worn into the room with such certainty an hour earlier. He said, to no one specifically, that he needed some air. My mother followed him out a moment later, her hand finding his arm again on the way to the door. This time it looked less like steadying a structure, more like two people leaving a building that had just quietly, without a single raised voice, been condemned. Brooke stayed behind. She looked at the folded distribution form's absence on the table, at the binder still closed under Underwood's hand, at me, for a long moment. I'm scared, she said simply. I don't know what happens to us now. I know how that feels, I said. I've been scared before too. It doesn't last as long as you think it will, once you stop pretending you're not. She left a few minutes later. Underwood and I sat in the conference room after everyone else had gone. The water pitcher still untouched. The parking lot outside still full of people finishing their own unremarkable, consequential mornings. You did that exactly the way your grandfather would have wanted, Underwood said. He closed the binder for the last time that day. He slid it toward me across the table. No theater, just the record, read out loud, in front of the people who needed to hear it. It didn't feel like winning, I said. It rarely does, he said. Not the real kind. The weeks that followed moved slower than I expected, the way real consequences almost always move slower than the movies suggest they will. Underwood's office sent formal notice to the bank, confirming my trustee status and the trust's refusal to serve as security for the loan. The bank, in turn, placed the entire construction loan into a formal review. Citing the withdrawn collateral representation, they gave Brooke and Danny 90 days to either produce alternative security or restructure the debt independently, based solely on their own credit and income, without any reference to my grandfather's trust at all. Danny's parents stepped in after all, the ones my father had quietly turned away months earlier, without telling anyone. Brooke had finally told them the full truth of what happened. They didn't cover the whole balloon payment, but they co-signed a smaller bridge loan that got Brooke and Danny through the refinance window, on considerably less generous terms than the original loan, with a monthly payment that would require both of them to actually live within a budget for the first time in their marriage. Brooke told me later that Danny's mother, handing over the paperwork, said only, "This is what family actually costs, sweetheart. I'm sorry nobody explained that to you sooner." The county recorder's office, separately, opened a routine review of my father's earlier filing, the one challenging the trustee amendment, not out of any dramatic legal action on my part, simply because a rejected filing citing a physician's evaluation triggers an automatic compliance flag under Iowa's trust statutes. I only learned that because Underwood mentioned it, almost as an aside, the way he mentioned most things that turned out to matter. The review didn't result in charges. It resulted in a formal letter to my father, on county letterhead, noting the rejected filing for the permanent record. A small, quiet, entirely bureaucratic consequence. From that point forward, anyone who ever pulled the county's records on that property would see something, in black and white, exactly what he had tried and failed to do. My father did not call me for 6 weeks after the title office meeting. When he finally did, it wasn't to apologize. Not directly, not in the shape I might have once wished for. He called to ask whether I still wanted to keep the farmhouse in the family. The trust technically owned it. He and my mother could no longer be certain, given everything, that they'd be the ones living in it forever. I told him yes. I told him the farmhouse had never been about who lived in it. It had been about it staying whole, staying paid for, staying exactly what Elmer built it to be. A place someone in this family could always come home to without owing anyone an explanation for showing up. I told him he and my mother could keep living there, as long as they honored the trust's actual terms, going forward, in writing. Underwood would review anything involving the property from that point on. He agreed. I don't think he had much choice left by then. But underneath the lack of choice, I think some smaller, quieter part of him was relieved. Relieved to finally be handed a structure he wasn't solely responsible for holding up. Brooke and I started talking again the way sisters actually talk. Not the performed closeness of family group texts and holiday photos. Real conversations, some of them awkward, some of them slow, all of them honest, in a way we'd never quite managed before. She came to my apartment for dinner one night that winter, the first snow of the season falling outside my kitchen window. She asked me, carefully, whether I'd ever really forgiven our parents. For the wedding, for the hospital room, for all of it. I don't think forgiveness is the right word for what I did, I told her. I think I just stopped waiting for them to become people who would have shown up. I let them be who they actually are, and I decided that didn't have to be the thing that broke me anymore. Is that the same as forgiving them? Maybe, I said. Or maybe it's just more accurate. I've found accuracy holds up a lot longer than the softer version of things. She laughed at that, a real laugh, and told me I sounded exactly like Grandpa, which I took and still take as the finest thing anyone has ever said to me about myself. I visited Denise Halloran again that spring, at the diner on Route 20. I brought her something I'd been meaning to for months, a photo I'd found going through an old box of Elmer's things, the two of them standing outside his truck, both of them squinting into the sun, his old cracked thermos visible on the dashboard behind them. She cried when I gave it to her, then laughed, the way people do when grief and gladness arrive in the same breath. She told me she was going to frame it, put it up behind the diner counter, right next to the register. Regulars had been asking about Elmer Doyle for 3 years. Nobody had thought to put his face back up where they could see it. That day, before I left, an old man at the counter told me something, a regular for decades. Elmer used to leave a $1 tip on a 50-cent coffee every single morning, rain or shine. He never once explained why, not to anyone. I formally set up a small standing distribution from the trust that spring, too. $200 a month, to a scholarship fund at the community college nursing program I'd graduated from, named quietly, without any plaque or announcement, for Elmer J. Doyle, for students who worked full-time jobs while training. Training to be the kind of person who shows up in the middle of the night, for people who never think to thank them. Underwood filed the paperwork without a single question. He'd stopped being surprised by anything I asked the trust to do months earlier. My father and I speak now, occasionally, carefully, the way two people speak when they both know a bridge between them was damaged, Neither one is entirely sure yet how much weight it can safely hold. Sometimes he calls just to ask how a shift went. Sometimes I call him first, about nothing in particular, a recipe or a weather report, just to prove to myself I still could. He came to my apartment once that spring, alone, without my mother. He stood in my kitchen doorway for a long moment before he said anything at all. "I don't think I ever really saw you," he said. "Not the way I should have. I think I saw what you did for this family a lot more clearly than I ever saw you." I didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't, entirely, not yet. I'd finally learned something. Saying it was fine before it actually was just taught people they could keep doing the thing that wasn't fine a little longer. "I know," I said. "I'd like it to be different going forward. I'm willing to find out if it can be, one ordinary Tuesday at a time, without either of us pretending it's already finished. That's where we still are, most days. Not healed exactly, not estranged either. Somewhere in the slow, unglamorous middle where most real repair actually happens, if it happens at all. Far from any single dramatic scene, built instead out of small, ordinary Tuesdays, where somebody finally shows up on time and means it. 2 winters after the wedding, almost to the day, I drove out to the farmhouse on a Sunday afternoon, the porch light already on, even though it wasn't dark yet. The way my grandfather always kept it. The way my father, without ever explaining why, had started keeping it too. My mother had made pot roast again, the same recipe. This time, when I said I couldn't stay long because I had an early shift, nobody made it into a referendum on my loyalty. My father asked genuinely how the scholarship fund was going. My mother asked whether I was seeing anyone. In the ordinary, mildly nosy way mothers are allowed to ask once they've earned the right to again. Brooke called partway through dinner just to say hello. My mother put her on speaker without asking. For a few minutes, the four of us talked over each other about nothing. The way families are supposed to, the way I'd almost forgotten this one could. I drove home that evening with the windows cracked, cold air coming in around the edges. I thought about the cream-colored card still sitting in my nightstand drawer, and the binder, now living on my own bookshelf instead of a stranger's cabinet, and the $600 I no longer sent because nobody needed me to hold anything up anymore that wasn't mine to hold. I stopped at the county line, where the road bends past the old grain elevator. I pulled over for no particular reason, except that the light was doing something worth watching. The last of the sun laying flat and gold across the harvested fields on either side of the highway. I sat there for a few minutes with the engine idling, thinking about a hospital monitor that had kept beeping long after anyone in my family thought to check on it. About a folded card that had waited 3 years for me to be ready to read it. About a grandfather who'd understood, long before any of the rest of us did, exactly which kind of quiet actually holds a family together. A crow landed on the fence post beside the car, looked at me for a moment, and flew off toward the tree line without any hurry at all. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Not anymore. I just sat there a while longer, in the gold light, engine running, both hands steady on the wheel. Then I drove the rest of the way home. A little more happened after that. The ordinary middle of a repair. The part nobody makes movies about, even though it usually matters more than the moment everything broke. Brooke and Danny's house got finished that summer, smaller in scope than the one they'd originally drawn up plans for. The bridge loan from Danny's parents came with conditions. It trimmed the extra square footage they'd once talked about. The way other people talk about vacations they can't quite afford yet. Brooke told me she didn't mind. She said living inside a house sized to what they could actually carry felt different than she expected. Less like a compromise, more like the first honest thing they'd built together. She invited me to the housewarming that August, a small gathering on the back patio. String lights strung between two young maple trees Danny had planted himself instead of hiring someone to do it. Nothing about the house was grand. The kitchen was small. The driveway was gravel, not poured. But it was theirs, fully, without a hidden lien or a father's signature quietly propping it up from somewhere out of sight. I brought Denise Halloran with me. Brooke hadn't met her before that afternoon. I watched my sister sit with her for almost an hour on the patio steps, asking questions about our grandfather that none of us, myself included, had ever thought to ask while he was alive to answer them. Denise told her about the thermos. Brooke cried a little, in the easy, unguarded way she'd always cried more freely than I had. Afterward, she hugged me and said she wished she'd known Denise existed years earlier. It felt, she said, like finding out there had been a whole other room in the house of our family, one nobody had ever bothered to show her. He kept a lot of rooms like that, I told her. You just have to be the kind of person who goes looking. My father showed up to the housewarming too, without my mother. She'd stayed home with a headache. I suspect it was at least partly a small act of self-protection. A woman not yet ready to sit in a backyard and watch her family function without her at its center. My father brought a toolbox instead of a card. He spent most of the afternoon fixing a wobbling porch railing Danny hadn't gotten around to yet, working quietly, competently, sleeves rolled up, the way I imagine he must have worked decades earlier, before whatever had slowly rusted its way into the load-bearing parts of him took hold. I watched him from across the yard for a while. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not quite forgiveness, not quite reconciliation, something smaller and more useful than either of those words. The simple, plain relief of watching a person finally do something ordinary and helpful, instead of something that required someone else to clean up after. He caught me watching. He came over afterward, wiping his hands on a rag, and asked if the railing looked steady enough now. I told him it did. He nodded, and for a moment, neither of us said anything else. I understood this, too, was a kind of language we were only just beginning to learn to speak to each other. The plain, undramatic vocabulary of showing up and doing the actual work instead of talking about having done it. Later that afternoon, he found a second job to do without being asked. A cracked step at the back porch. He didn't mention it to anyone. He just fixed it, quietly, the way his own father used to fix things, and left before anyone thought to thank him for it. That fall, Brooke asked if she could see the cream-colored card, the one I'd carried unopened for 3 years and read 4 times alone at my kitchen table the night of her wedding. I hadn't shown it to anyone, not Josh, not Underwood, not even Denise. I thought about it for a few days before I said yes. We sat together on my couch on a Sunday afternoon, rain against the window. I handed her the envelope the way Underwood had once handed it to me, without ceremony, without explaining what was inside before she'd had the chance to read it herself. She read it slowly. I watched her face change the way mine must have changed 3 years earlier. The specific stillness of someone realizing a dead man had seen something about them, or about their family, that nobody living had bothered to say out loud. He knew, she said quietly when she finished. He knew exactly what this family was, and he built something to survive it anyway. He did, I said softly. Do you think he knew it would be you? Specifically? I thought about the thermos. I thought about the $200 a month to a woman named Denise Halloran. Nobody else in our family had ever thought to ask about her. I thought about a locked drawer in a roll-top desk that my father had tried and failed to force open the week after the funeral. about how Underwood had quietly handed me its key 18 months later, along with the binder. Neither of us ever made a production of it. I think he built it so it could be whoever actually showed up, I said. It happened to be me. It could have been you if things had gone differently. I don't think he was trying to choose a favorite. I think he was trying to build something that couldn't be fooled by the people who were good at performing love instead of practicing it. Brooke folded the card back into its envelope and handed it back to me. Careful with it. The way you're careful with something you've finally understood is more fragile and more permanent than it first appears. I don't think I ever practiced it, she said. Not with you. I think I just assumed you'd always be there, the way you assume a porch light will always be on, without ever asking who's paying for the electricity. You're asking now, though, I said. That's not nothing. She stayed for dinner that night. We didn't talk about the trust again, or the wedding, or the balloon payment, or any of it. We talked about nothing important. The ordinary nothing of two sisters slowly learning how to simply be in a room together. No old debt sitting at the table between them. It was, I think, the best evening the two of us had spent together in over a decade. Neither of us needed to say that out loud for it to be true. Before she left, she asked if she could come back the following month, just for dinner, nothing to discuss. And I said yes before she'd even finished the question. The scholarship fund gave out its first award that fall, $400, to a 22-year-old named Priya Desai. She was working 3 overnight shifts a week at a nursing home while finishing her clinical rotations. The kind of quiet, unglamorous effort my grandfather had built his entire understanding of loyalty around. Underwood sent me the paperwork to sign as trustee. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, the same table where I'd first opened a cream-colored card 2 winters earlier. I signed my name at the bottom of that small, ordinary document. I felt closer to my grandfather than I had since his funeral. I still work nights on the surgical floor. I still notice who shows up to the hospital and who doesn't. The specific weather of a family under pressure. The ones who bring blankets from home and the ones who check their phones in the doorway like the hallway is an inconvenience. I don't judge them the way I might have 2 winters ago. I just notice quietly the way my grandfather taught me to notice things, without needing to announce what I've seen. That fall, a resident I was training asked me over a slow shift how I managed to stay so calm with difficult families. The ones who shout at the nurse's station or demand answers nobody can give them yet. Her name was Alina. She was 24, sharp, still learning where to put her hands and her voice at the same time. I told her something I hadn't quite put into words before that moment, though I'd apparently been living by it for 2 years. I don't get loud, I said. I get accurate. The loud part usually takes care of itself once the facts are actually on the table. She wrote that down, which surprised me. I laughed. I told her she didn't need to write it down. It wasn't really advice, just something my grandfather would have said better. She asked me who he was. I found myself telling her about it, in the middle of a slow overnight shift, about a thermos and a truck and 80 acres east of a small Iowa town, about a woman named Denise who still keeps his photograph by the register of a diner on Route 20, about a granddaughter who took 27 years to understand that quiet is not invisible, who finally, at 29, stopped waiting to be asked, who claimed the pen that had been hers all along. That evening, driving home past the old grain elevator, I thought about the folded card one more time, the one still sitting exactly where I'd left it. I thought about how strange it is. The people who love you best sometimes have to be gone before you're ready to hear what they meant. I thought about the porch light. My grandfather kept it burning every night of his life for people who might need to find their way home in the dark. Driving past that same light, still glowing gold against the early evening sky, I finally understood something. I had become, without ever quite deciding to, exactly the kind of person he'd built that whole quiet, patient trust to protect. I turned onto Fenwick Road, slow, the tires quiet on the gravel. The porch light was still on.